to today about, and I see quite a few familiar faces, so I'm not going to rehash the whole process of biodiversity conservation planning and how we go about that. I'm just going to give you some quick feedback with regards to what's developed since September or developed since the last time I presented at the forum, and then go straight into the strategy and action plan, because that's really where I want some feedback and engagement on the topic, because it affects various levels within the province, down to research institutions.
Oh, you just click the right.
That's right. So just a very brief background. A biodiversity conservation plan is a tool to promote biodiversity conservation by retaining and maintaining examples of our biodiversity and important ecological process areas, our infrastructure. And it's essentially a map of critical biodiversity areas, or CDAs, and their ecological support areas, which are ESAs, accompanied by some contextual information, as well as some land and resource use guidelines, all in GIS format. The CDA Map is produced according to principles and methods of systematic biodiversity planning as per the SAMB guidelines. So how you go about it is fairly standardized across the country, so we don't land up with different provinces saying different things. We're not comparing different fruits. We've all got a very similar looking product. So since last year, September, we have effected 3 changes due to various inputs that we've received. And the first one is our interpretation and use of other plans. As mentioned last year, we have 31 other biodiversity-related plans in the province, and using these plans was a tricky deal because they're undertaken at different scales. They use different types of information, and they say things slightly differently. Some underwent a systematic process to identify important biodiversity areas. Others, I'm not sure what they used, but just not reliable information. So what we did is we tried to apply a standardized scale to those plans, and use them quite softly to inform maybe where we should be going in terms of prioritizing critical biodiversity areas. And what was happening is it was diluted when we added to other types of information like pressures and threats. And so what we've done is, I'll talk about that in the next slide, but just the other things we've done is we've added quite a substantial amount of biodiversity information through expert mapping, as well as Cape and bearded vulture information. So as I was saying, these 31 other plans are now used more explicitly. By that I mean we lock them in. So the Nelson Mandela Bay Bioregional Plan, the Sandparks Addo Biodiversity Project, and the CBAs in neighbouring provinces, any areas that were identified as CBA or similar in those plans have been locked into our map. In other words, they directly inform the CBAs in our map. Other areas were used as opportunity areas in the Marxan analysis, and we increased the weighting of that. I'm happy to talk about the technical ins and outs of Andrews. You can chat to me about that later, or chat to Philip. But it's quite a technical process that I don't necessarily want to go into now. So this is one of the products, output products of our revised integration of those maps. We've got some more expert mapping. Richard Cowling helped us identify bioregions along the coastline. So the top left-hand table has been used to inform our coastal belt. And then the top right-hand side, we've got some really nice information from Elise Clutie and more updated inputs from Rolf Clark. And then Elise mentioned to us something we didn't know before, these serpentine soils around the Mount Aleph area, and the possible presence of unique species in response to those toxic soils. We've also taken 6 different data sets for the Cape vulture in the province. Surprisingly enough, there's a lot of inconsistency between those data sets. There are different monitoring times. There are times when there's no monitoring. We're not sure of the breeding pairs. We're not sure where the vultures are going. We're not sure of roosts versus colonies. Some people say a roost is a colony and there's breeding happening. Others say there's no breeding. So there's a lot of inconsistency between the data sets, and what we sought to do is try and get some sort of overarching idea of what's going on with our Cape vultures. And we had to do this primarily because of the wind, renewable energy, strategic environmental assessment, and we as a province need to try and develop some sort of policy position on that. We also got information from Isabella Wildlife on the bearded vulture nest sites. If I'm not mistaken, there are about 21 in the Eastern Cape. A lot of them are empty. They've been vacated for 6 years. But it's important that we display that information, we use that information. It's habitat, and if the species ever makes a comeback, that's where they'll likely go. So where we are now is the 3rd draft of the CDA Map, which will hopefully be gazetted quite shortly for public review. I'm also happy to share or chat through this. I've got it on my computer, and it's as a PDF, and it takes about 30 seconds to load because of all the information on it. But it will be available on the Department of Environmental Affairs environmental screening website. This is the aquatic CBA layer, showing the dark blue CJ1 Rivers, the lighter blue CDA rivers. You can't quite see, but there are wetland areas and groundwater areas included in this map, especially the Cedarville wetlands, if anybody knows about those up at the top there. Yeah, there you go. Cedarville wetlands at the top. You have to zoom in to actually see tiny little wetlands. So I'd like to move on to the strategy and action plan, and where the conservation plan has an objective to promote biodiversity conservation. Strategy and action plan sets out an integrated strategy for the conservation, management and sustainable use of biodiversity. So the structure of a strategy and action plan, and it's typically called a BSAP, is that there are strategic objectives that are developed, and in order to achieve these objectives, certain outcomes need to happen. So things need to happen in order to achieve our strategies. What we then do is develop some actions, timeframes, lead agents, targets, because stuff needs to happen in order for outcomes to be achieved, and outcomes need to happen for strategic objectives to be achieved. So this is the general structure of a BSAP. And we have a national BSAP. Does anybody know that we have a national BSAP? Has anyone ever looked at it? I hadn't until I started this project either. But what surprised me is so many of these strategic objectives, outcomes and actions are actually being implemented, mostly through SANBI, but a lot of the projects sounded familiar. A lot of the outcomes are actually happening. So in the background there are people actually working on this document and making a big difference in the country. Out of interest, one of these actions is in fact developing a biodiversity conservation plan. So that's one of the things that I'm talking to you about today, is actually an action in our national strategy and action plan. This is what the current national BSAP looks like. I'm not going to go into great detail, but it's a really nice read. And some of these outcomes are mandated to the province, which makes them relevant and need to be pulled through into the provincial context. But mostly these strategy or these strategic objectives are developed at a national scale. And so we really need to make things a little bit more specific at a provincial level. And there are specific threats unique to this province that need to be addressed. And some of our key threats or pressures are habitat loss. I think that's universal. But there's also presence and spread of alien invasives, which is particularly extreme in our music environments. There's a legal and policy approach to bush encroachment, which is a recurring theme. And we've got a lot of pollution and waste that we need to deal with. So this is not a comprehensive list, but just something for you to chew on. But essentially we need appropriate intervention at a provincial level. And whilst developing the biodiversity conservation plan, we were hearing a lot about the issues on the ground that needed to be fed in to the provincial BSAP. So the two are uniquely linked. And when we look, or when we talk about actions or outcomes, we can actually be geographically specific about where these things need to happen. As a first draft that no one's really seen yet, we've outlined 8. Now the national NBSAP has 6, the Western Cape have 7, and I felt that the Eastern Cape has a lot of work to do. We're not very ahead of the game. We've had a conservation plan in place much longer than any other province, but we still seem to be lagging behind. So the first strategic objective, and I'm going to flash through them very quickly, is conservation and effective management of biodiversity. Contributes towards a thriving populace and persistence of biodiversity for future generations. Second is investment into ecosystem infrastructure. And by that we're also talking about ecosystem adaptation-based infrastructure. Thirdly, we're looking at mainstreaming biodiversity priorities into planning and development sectors. And we've heard a lot about how to walk biodiversity sector plans into land use planning, SPLUMA type SDFs, IDPs, into municipal level planning. Fourthly, a biodiversity economy is explored and developed. And I think the Eastern Cape has a huge potential that is largely untapped. And what's critical is that it contributes towards sustainable livelihoods and development opportunities in the Eastern Cape. What's really important, and I think I'll go through some outcomes just now. First is effective management of knowledge. Sixth is adapt or adopt practices to achieve sustainable use. And to me, that's particularly important in areas where there's land degradation. We can adapt or change our land use to a more sustainable land use type. Then I'm talking about capable and capacitated institutions. So you may be capable, but you don't have the financial or just the time resources to apply your capabilities. So a capable and capacitated institution can achieve biodiversity management objectives. And then lastly, resource mobilization. So all of this costs money, and where do we find that? So I'm just going to talk about the first 5 strategic objectives and some of the outcomes that need to be, things that need to happen in order to achieve that strategic objective. The first is a network of protected and conservation areas and the insurance that those areas are secured for protection and conservation. Another outcome is protected and management, protection and management of ecological infrastructure, improved management of current protected areas. So that's one of the issues that came out during the Biodiversity Conservation Plan, is that there are some protected areas gazetted that have just fallen into disuse and are in fact degraded. And the problem with that is that these protected areas contribute towards our calculation of targets that have been achieved. As an example, the Cathcart protected area is covered in blue gum and wattle, and it's actually, in my box on my spreadsheet, it counts or contributes towards meeting a target, a biodiversity target. So it's one of the bigger problems in the Eastern Cape, is that before we start expanding our network, to look after the current network. Then the outcome is biodiversity management plans are developed. So that's for species as well as for ecosystems. And those management plans aren't necessarily going to help with the citrus issue. I think an SCA is a better mechanism for that. But biodiversity management plans for Cape vultures, for hornbills, is adequate. But also ecosystems that we're talking about are the mangrove estuaries, the coastal wetland systems, and then lastly, revised threat status of ecosystems for gazetting. I think they're all made available, but at a provincial level, we calculate them differently. If I'm correct, Andrew, at a provincial level, you use what's in the province to calculate the threat status.
Usually, we want to.
You want to do a cumulative. For the current situation, there are, I think, at least 4 vegetation types which have increased in their threat status. And what we hope to achieve out of this outcome is having those threatened ecosystems gazetted under a NIMBA. Investment into ecological infrastructure. So there are 2 outcomes here, and some people have kind of collapsed these 2 strategic objectives, but I really feel that they need to be separate. The first is facilitating, coordinating maintenance and restoration of ecological infrastructure. I know there's a lot of work going on around Yugi, Maclear. I think Mike's involved there in catchment level restoration, and then we're also talking about ecosystem-based adaptation creates resilience to climate change. We also want to mainstream biodiversity into sectoral plans and policies. And how we do that is we develop science-based tools for informed decision-making. So this speaks directly to what Andries is saying. He needs a tool in order to make a good decision. That science-based tool may be an SCA, it may be an EMF, depending on the situation. We need to, the outcome, economic and development sectors are actively contributing to conservation. So when we're saying set asides or offsets, that's an active contribution. There is integration of biodiversity considerations into municipal planning, and biodiversity is integrated into traditional land settlement and land use through community-driven initiatives. And this is really one of the big outcomes of this assessment, is that in the former homelands, there is no real formal reach that can be implemented through the municipal systems. And so engaging with traditional leadership and traditional means of settlement and land use, engage with those communities at a community level, and I think it's called community level planning. Partnering with the Department of Traditional Affairs and trying to get better planning and land use out of these areas. Exploring the biodiversity economy, essentially what we need to know is what's out there, what can we use, what is being used, what can be commercialized, and when we say opportunities, we mean the wildlife economy, commercialization of species. There's a whole list of avenues we could look at. But more importantly, existing biodiversity economy contributes positively to conservation targets. And what I'm speaking to here is the huge area around Grahamstown, between Grahamstown and PE. That's basically wall-to-wall game farming, game ranching, reserves that are not necessarily contributing positively to biodiversity conservation. And so a strategy needs to be developed to try and drop some fences, drop some walls. But yeah, that needs to be explored a little bit more. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is effective management of knowledge. And I think that's what we're all talking about today, is where is the information, how do we access it, how do we use it to inform decisions. One of the outcomes is all levels of biodiversity management is based on the best available science. So that depends or relies completely on science actually happening, and then filtering through into policy levels. We also need data and knowledge to be communicated in an accessible and meaningful way. It's no use writing astrophysics, for someone who's going to authorize a wind turbine. It's just, we need something that is tangible and is easily usable for everybody. We need to undertake research focused mainly on management and policy requirements, and we need to facilitate that in the province. There needs to be a geographical biodiversity prioritization, and that these areas are prioritized and that this prioritization is updated regularly. Another outcome is biodiversity threat status is monitored, so that includes species as well as ecosystems. On a regular basis, we need to update our knowledge and understanding on the threat status. And then lastly, important biodiversity areas that are under highest threat are prioritized for appropriate intervention. This is a particularly important aspect of the Eastern Cape assessment, because the areas under highest threat are in fact the areas under highest pressure. And then just the way forward, Pumla Zazi is going to be hopefully gazetting the final draft for public review, and that's the CDA Map and Land Use Guidelines and associated reports. And then we're going to be circulating the draft Strategy and Action Plan framework for additional comment and input. And that's where we are.